WTTW 11. This is Chicago Tonight. Here's Bob Surratt.
Welcome. On Chicago Tonight, there's still a Chicago factory that manufactures pinball games and a legion of fans who prefer the old games to the video variety. We'll take a look at the history of a business that got its start in Chicago. Once upon a time, Chicago was the pinball capital of the world, home to the game's major manufacturers. But today, in the wake of the video games blitz, there's only one pinball manufacturer left here. What future does pinball have in the era of PlayStation and the Xbox? We checked in with a few pinball wizards to find out. Mike Vanacore has 18 pinball machines in his home. His passion for the game developed about 10 years ago when he got a job testing video games. After a few years of playing video games for a living, he got pretty sick of them, so he started playing pinball in his free time. Now Mike is part of a dying breed of pinball enthusiasts.
Yeah, it seems like it's a pretty small group now. I mean, there are others like me too, but other people moved on to like video games, and they got the computer games and stuff.
At arcades across the country, it's the same story. Kids just aren't playing pinball. Most prefer to play video games at home. The experts are left wondering about the future of pinball.
I think that there tends to be a future for pinball because it's clearly still a dynamic game, but I don't know that it's ever going to have the presence in the market that it used to have.
Gary Stern has heard all of this before. His Melrose Park factory is the only one in the world that's still making new pinball machines.
The market is significantly smaller than it was 10 years ago for a number of reasons. There's room for one pinball machine company to make a living.
Gary talks about pinball like it's an endangered species that he's determined to save.
We all have a mission. We're dedicated to preserving an American icon. If we ever stop, I believe there will be no more pinball machines.
It's only fitting that pinball's making its last stand here in Chicago. The game practically owes its existence to the city. In the early 1930s, Chicago companies like Gottlieb and Bally were the first to mass-produce pinball games. The game was incredibly profitable, and other Chicago companies soon followed.
These games would sometimes bring enough money over only one weekend just to pay for the game. So what happened is these companies produced anywhere from 40 to 50 to 60,000 games.
Steve Kordick was actually there in those early days. He worked in the pinball industry for 63 years. His claim to fame? He's the guy who designed the first pinball machine with 2 flippers. That was soon after the end of World War II. It was about then that Chicago's pinball industry really took off. Through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, what is considered by many to be the game's heyday, Chicago was the pinball capital of the world.
Oh, 70s, the 60s, the 70s, and the early 80s were unbelievable in this industry. Heck, we were manufacturing average of 7,000 to 8,000 games a run, and sometimes as many as 15, 16, 17,000.
Yet even as Chicago companies were cranking out thousands of machines, you couldn't play pinball here. Pinball was illegal in Chicago until 1976.
Pinball had largely been seen as gambling by local authorities. New York and Chicago were some of the last major cities to legalize pinball because of that.
But by the late 70s, video games started taking a bite out of pinball sales.
The arcade video game boom that really got started in 1979 was the beginning of the end. In a lot of ways, I can't say that pinball players ceased to be around, but the companies that operate games found it a lot easier to operate video games than they did pinball games from a pure maintenance standpoint.
Pinball machines have so many mechanical parts that the repair costs made them a real pain. And they were becoming pretty expensive to make, too. In the 1970s, manufacturers started putting a lot of electronics into the machines, yet they still had to be built by hand.
By the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s, you had to have at least a 3,000 run just to pay for the expenses of engineering games.
It wasn't that pinball stopped selling. In the 90s, Chicago's Williams Electronics sold a record 22,000 Addams Family games. But it got harder and harder to recoup the costs of making the games. And by 1998, Williams was the only locally owned pinball maker left. In a last-ditch effort to stay in the game, Williams devised a concept called Pinball 2000. It didn't work. They stopped making Pinball 2000 in 1999 and decided to try their luck at gambling devices. But in October of that year, Gary Stern bought his company back from Sega. The future of pinball in his hands, Stern's plan is to draw from the game's past. He says that over the years, pinball just got way too complicated.
When we first put microprocessors in pinball machines in the late 70s, we were on the leading edge of technology. We couldn't export to certain countries because we had microprocessors. These were military secrets almost. Now, you know, we are back to making an entertainment and not a technology. So we make what we call mechanical action pinball. A lot of mechanical things going on. Casual player, if he hits a stand-up target and lights a light in front of it, he may not see that. But if it's a drop target and falls down, he sees the physical state change. It was something good to do. If he makes a ramp, he sees the ball go around it. He saw that happen. He knows what to do. It teaches him. He's self-educating. He was satisfied, and he does it again.
The idea is to hook the pinball novice who might get confused by a lot of bells and whistles.
One of the problems with pinball as the art form progressed was that it became too complex for many of the players.
The player gets better, so the designers make the game harder. And then the player gets better, they make it more difficult to understand and figure out. Better, more difficult, and then this player stays home because he had kids and doesn't go out as much or this or that, and you have a whole new crop of players that are down here and can't play the game up here. We're making a game that can satisfy all the players and be somewhere in between.
Stern is also attracting new pinball players using licensed names like Harley-Davidson and The Simpsons. Right now they're in production on a Terminator 3 game.
The license tends to draw casual players. A person who might not have been interested in playing a pinball game with a generic title is attracted to a license that they recognize.
And what about the competition from home video games? Believe it or not, a lot of pinball machines are ending up in America's living rooms. And this just might be the future of pinball.
In the post-9/11 era, many families have been upgrading their homes and trying to find ways to keep their families closer to home. And one of the ways they've done that is by investing in home recreation centers, and a pinball game has found itself in many of these.
In the meantime, Stern Pinball can depend on enthusiasts like Mike Vanacore. Every now and then, the company will test market a new game at a surprise location. And within a day or two, the fanatics will be lining up to play it.
You'll see in the pinball news group on the internet, people asking where it's at, and then people will actually come in from other states to come see the new games first.
Gary Stern can rest assured that pinball fans around the world are rooting for him.
He is making games, and I'm plugging like all hell for him that he stays in the business because he's the only one that's left.
As long as they just keep making games that are fun to play, then I'll keep coming back to play more.
If you want to get an idea of just how serious people are about pinball, have a look on the internet. You'll find pinball collectors, international conventions, and highly competitive tournaments everywhere.